Okay, welcome. We are continuing our series of videos on social and political philosophy today with a look at a chapter from a book by Michael Huemer. Uh, his book is called The Problem of Political Authority, and this time around we're going to look at one of the most popular explanations of political authority, the so called social contract theory that is meant to legitimize the existence and the power of the state. Uh, so here's the plan for today. I want to quickly review Huemer's challenge, what he's calling the problem of political authority. We'll talk about consent to coercion and the explicit contract theory, or the explicit version of the social contract theory. We'll then move on to the implicit theory. We'll look at some principles of valid contracts, and we'll look at the question, have we implicitly consented to the coercion of the government? And remarkably, for some of you, Huemer is going to answer no. There is no such thing as a social contract functioning basically anywhere in the world. And on that basis, he's going to say an appeal to the social contract is not a good explanation of why the government is entitled to act as it does. So, without any further review, here's the challenge that Huemer left us with. He says that we need to understand the concept of political authority in order to understand why the government gets to do what it does. We ask this question about whether a vigilante could lock up criminals in their basement and then require their neighbors to pay them money to fund their crime prevention program. Huemer suggests that that would not be justified, and furthermore, that we then need an explanation of the state's political authority. If private citizens don't get to lock up criminals and tax people, why is it that the state gets to do this? Within this picture, he's noting that governments are inherently coercive. Ultimately, your refusal to obey the government is something that you can't ignore or defy forever, because eventually their threats are going to be backed up with the threat of violence. Right? You can't defy the police anymore in the way that you avoid paying a speeding ticket when the police eventually come and drag you to jail. Right? So this idea of coercion is central to Huemer's challenge, right? Why is it the state eventually gets to use physical force or the threat of it to induce a person to perform certain desired actions? Right? So that's where we got last time. That's the problem of political authority. And this time around, we're going to look at this question of whether we could explain political authority through agreement to what is sometimes called the social contract. As Huemer notes, this is a very popular theory. We might even think that most Americans believe that this is the explanation of why the government is endowed with the power that it has. So here's a first thought. While it does seem problematic for anyone to coerce another person, we will notice that some things that aren't permissible become permissible when we consent to it. So, for instance, if I end up signing a contract with you, whereby, for instance, you give me some money and then I am contractually obligated to mow your lawn once a month for the rest of the year, well, we would say that there are certain things that you can force me to do and that you can enact punishments on me if I don't do when we engage in that kind of contract, right? And in this way, if you promise contractually to pay for a good, then you can be forced to pay for that good. And if you contractually agree to offer a service, then you can be forced to provide that service eventually, or, of course, you might have your payment revoked. This is the case for other things. So, for instance, Uh, it's not okay for other people to cut you with knives. Uh, but, of course, if you consent to a surgery and hire a doctor to perform a surgery on you, in that case, that consent converts a wrong action, cutting with a knife, into a permissible action. Uh, so here's the starting thought. We might think that the reason why the state is legitimate is because there is consent to a contract between the state and the people. Uh, and this leads us to what we might call an explicit contract theory, that we have explicitly made the decision to give up certain rights or to provide certain tax payments in order to get the goods that the state provides us. So if you believe the explicit contract theory, here's what you believe. If citizens have agreed to pay the government for its services and have agreed to be subjected to coercion if they fail to, for instance, pay the tax, then it is permissible for the government to force the citizen to pay. And Huemer points out that John Locke, did seem to believe a version of this theory, that in the founding of the government, people gave, through explicit consent, jurisdiction over the land from themselves to the state. The problem with this theory, Huemer points out, is that the theory has little historical backing. So, in this way, Huemer agrees with the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, who was also a critic of social contract theories. And Hume tells us that this story of people voluntarily consenting to putting a government in place just doesn't match with history. Right? Most states, as Hume puts it, are founded on usurpation or conquest. This is basically like either colonizing land or winning power over land through war. And it goes without saying, this is true of the United States, right? The entities which eventually became the United States government and then passed the government on to its current office holders. Well, how did they come to be in power in the first place? Well, it was through the theft of control of land here in America from indigenous peoples, right? So we did not form the United States government on the basis of consent. Rather, the people who basically took control of this land took it through force. And even pieces of land that were added to the United States in later decades, in later centuries, such as through the Louisiana Purchase, well, that was stolen land too, that we then got in trades with other imperial powers. So basically, there is no situation in which we can think of the founding of any jurisdiction of the U.S. government as founded through this sort of explicit contract that Locke seemed to believe in. We would also notice that most of us have not made this consent to a social contract, right? How do we get to be citizens of a certain country? Well, usually we're just born into it, right? And in this way, we don't ever make the decision to become a subject of a state. This is slightly untrue for myself because I'm an immigrant to the United States, right? I am currently a permanent resident, still with Canadian citizenship. And should I ever decide to become a U.S. citizen, I would, in fact, take an oath of citizenship. And in that sort of way, we might think that some people in the situation of immigrating to a country and voluntarily deciding to become a citizen of that country, well, in that case, we might think of that as a certain kind of explicit consent to being a subject of a particular government. But we might at least notice that that is an exception rather than the rule. We might notice that it would be kind of wild to say that only explicit consent to the government counts as legitimating government power, because that would only mean that naturalized immigrant citizens and maybe a few other people who have explicitly taken an oath of citizenship would be legitimate subjects of the government. So, as Huemer points out, the explicit contract theory is factually bunk on a number of dimensions. It doesn't actually explain how governments are formed, and moreover, for each individual, it's probably not a good explanation of how they became a citizen. So we might say no notable contemporary political theorist accepts this approach. So if you believe that the government's authority is based on a contract, you don't believe that there is an explicit contract where the government has laid out terms and the citizen has explicitly signed up for it. Right? So then we can ask this question. Well, how is it that in some situations a person could implicitly consent to a contract? And Huemer doesn't just write this possibility off. He points out that there are many cases where we do incur contractual obligations, even though those contractual obligations were not explicitly consented to. So he gives us some examples of implicit consent. First thing that involves implicit consent is that a person could refrain from opposing. So this is what we might call passive consent. Here's an example. You are working in an office and the chairman in the board meeting says, "Raise your hand if you object my moving the meeting to Tuesday." And in this situation, everybody else in the boardroom just sits there silently and passively. And after enough silence passes, the chairman says, "Okay, that settles it. We're moving the meeting to Tuesday." So we consent without actually saying, "I hereby consent." 2, there are some cases where an individual will solicit or voluntarily accept benefits. So for instance, you walk into a restaurant, you go up to the counter and order a sandwich, you eat your sandwich. At that point, you have voluntarily incurred a contractual obligation to pay the restaurant, right? Even though you never said, "I hereby request that you bring me a sandwich, in which condition I will pay you the price listed on the menu for said sandwich." People don't talk like that. But it's well understood that in our society, when you go into a restaurant and solicit a benefit, there will be an expected payment on your part after receiving the benefit. We might also say that there are some situations where you can consent to a contract through presence. Huemer gives a fun example here. He says, imagine there's a party at Mike Huemer's house, and people are having fun and carrying on. But at some point during the party, Huemer stops the music and says, "Hey, I have an announcement." And it's that if you stay past now, I will expect you to chip in cleaning up. So you're going to have to gather some dishes. You're going to have to roll up your sleeves. Maybe somebody's going to have to sweep up. Somebody's going to have to take out the garbage. All that kind of stuff. Now, you've got a choice in this situation, right? If you don't want to clean up, you can leave Huemer's house. And in that situation, if you stay and keep on partying, that means that before you leave, you are going to have to sweep up or take out the garbage or gather some bottles, right? That's what you incurred as your contractual obligation by remaining present at the party. And we might also notice that sometimes you can incur a contractual obligation by voluntarily participating in a practice, right? So in this situation, you might make a bet, right? Or play a class lottery. So in Huemer's example, he says, everybody who wants to play the class lottery, write your name on a piece of paper, drop it into this hat, and then he pulls a name out of the hat. That person is the winner, and everybody else who put their name into the hat owes that winner $1. It would be rather strange for one of the losers of this class lottery to say, hey, I don't have to pay them $1. I never said I would. I just like writing my name on pieces of paper and putting it in hats. Well, we might say that if we can reasonably expect a person to understand what they were doing by voluntarily participating in the class lottery, they have incurred a certain kind of obligation to pay up to the winner. So some theorists have said that something like these sorts of consent, refraining from opposing, receiving certain benefits, consenting through presence in a country, or voluntarily participating in practices, perhaps things like voting, could then be a way of relating to the government in a way that constitutes consent. So what we're going to do is, for Huemer, he's going to say that these modes of explanation cannot be successfully appealed to in explaining how the government is formed and what legitimates it. Just to give one example of consent through presence, you might think that just being in the United States, you have consented to being subject to its laws in a similar way, like by remaining at Huemer's house, you have consented to this obligation later on to clean up, right? But Huemer points out that in the case of his house, he gets to create these conditions on remaining there because the house belongs to him, right? But before the social contract is created, there is no government that owns the land and has jurisdiction over it. So it's not as if there's a private entity that owns the land that can then create conditions on what you are obligated to do just by remaining there. So again, we see that the attempt to apply these modes of implicit consent to a contract, while they might work in some situations, Huemer will eventually tell us that none of them can work as a good explanation of the relationship between the citizen and the state. And here's part of how he's going to set this up. He's going to say there are principles of valid contracts, and that if these principles are not met, then the contract will be invalidated. So not every situation where somebody is participating in a practice or just passively being present will incur the same obligations. So he points out that valid consent to a contract requires a reasonable way of opting out. So I gave you that example of the boardroom where the boss says, raise your hand if you object to moving the meeting to Tuesday. Well, you can't say, if you object to moving the meeting to Tuesday, you'll need to cut off your arm. And the way that Huemer says, you have the right not to be made to cut off your arms. He even says, like, it would be wrong for the boss to say, if you have an objection, give me $1, because you also have a right to your money, right? And we might think that by asking people to give up things that they have a right and an entitlement to, that is an unreasonable way of asking people to opt out, right? So opting out has to be reasonable. Another thing we might say is explicit dissent trumps alleged implicit consent. Now, what does this mean? It means that there might be situations where you simply say, you might think that this is a situation where I am implicitly consenting to a certain contractual obligation, but I will not take that contractual obligation on. So go back to the restaurant example. If you go to the restaurant and you go to the counter and you tell your server, I would like a sandwich, but let me be clear. Uh, After you bring me that sandwich and I eat it, I will not pay you a thing for it. I expect to be given the sandwich for free. I expect to pay nothing. Now, if the server then brings you the sandwich and you eat it, your explicit dissent to the regular course of contractual obligation, they knew full well that you announced your intention to not pay. So they can't then say, after bringing you the good on these new terms that you've stipulated, they can't then go back and say that you owe them the original price. It was understood that you were expecting the sandwich without payment. Right? So if you refuse a contractual obligation out loud, you cannot be taken to consent to it. He also points out actions imply consent only if those actions can be assumed, only if it can be assumed, excuse me. So you're consenting only if you don't do the certain thing, then you don't have the obligation anymore. Right? So, for instance, the boss could say, raise your arm if you want me to move the meeting to something other than Tuesday. But then they announce, no matter what you say, the meeting's being moved to Tuesday. Right? At that point, basically what the boss is doing is just announcing that the meeting has been moved to Tuesday, and there is no way in which consent makes a difference one way or the other. Right? So you need to be given the option to opt out. Right? If there is no option to opt out, then you're not really making an offer. You're just telling somebody. And the last thing, we'd say contractual obligation is mutual and conditional, which means that when I enter into a contract, I am giving up my right to something to you as you are giving up the right to something of yours to me, right? So in any contract, it's like, look, I will give you my time and my services so long as you give me some of your money, right? And there might be an agreement to that contract, but then the one party doesn't provide the services. Well, in that case, then the other party doesn't have to provide payment. You may have experienced this at a restaurant every now and again, right? A bunch of orders come in, and then the appetizer never comes, and what you do in that kind of situation is you say, oh, don't worry about it, but then you check the bill and you make sure that the appetizer is not on the bill because it never came to the table, so your obligation to pay for it is no longer there, right? So we might say, you have to do your part only if the other party does theirs. And in that way, we say that there's a mutuality to contracts and there's a conditionality. If the other person doesn't do their part, you don't have to do your part anymore. Now, we can then run through these 4 conditions of valid contracts with the social contract between the citizen and the state that is alleged to be there. Now, this first principle says, look, valid consent to a contract requires a reasonable way of opting out. So the thought is, I will be subject to the government's laws and the government's coercion, but if you are not given a reasonable way of opting out of that obligation, then it's not a valid contract. Huemer points out that the only way to opt out of the social contract is to move. Sometimes you'll hear people talk like this, right? If you don't like America, you should move somewhere else. I'm not endorsing this line of thought, but this is how some people talk, right? Now, maybe one reason why this is perhaps not a helpful line of thought, and that it's even kind of offensive, is that a person has to give up a lot of financial resources. They have to be given the opportunity to move to some other country. You can't just move to any country that you feel like on a whim. Just like, you can move to any state in the United States just because you feel like it if you're already a resident of the United States, but you can't move to any country just because you feel like it, right? Not only would it be hard and financially difficult, but you would also have to give up family, friends, and valuable social relationships. Huemer also points out, isn't it a weird situation that if you're the sort of libertarian anarchist who just doesn't want to be subject to government coercion, and you just don't want to be the sort of individual who pays taxes? Well, the problem with leaving the United States, where for Canada, you're just going to be subject to yet another government. So in that way, you don't have a reasonable way of opting out of government coercion. And in this way, Huemer is going to say there isn't a reasonable way of opting out of the social contract. You have a right to make decisions about your financial resources and to maintain relationships with your family and friends, just like you have the right not to be forced to cut your arm off. And in that way, you can't be expected to move to a completely different part of the world just to have a government situation that's more agreeable to you. In this way, Huemer's going to say this required reasonable way of opting out isn't actually on the table when we think of how the citizen relates to the state. Second principle, explicit dissent trumps implicit consent, right? So if you come into the restaurant and say, hey, I'm not into this whole paying for food thing, but bring me food if you can, please. In that situation, you don't have a genuine obligation to pay the bill. But the government is not like that restaurant because the social contract fails to recognize explicit dissent. So there are people who are political anarchists. They believe that society would be better if it were stateless. And if they were given the true choice, they would rather not receive government benefits and they would rather not pay taxes. But guess what? The government continues to tax them and continues to impose laws on them, even though they don't want it. And they are loud and clear about that fact. So in this way, it makes no sense to say that somebody tacitly consents to a contract when they are loudly and clearly expressing explicit dissent, right? It's almost kind of a bit of gaslighting, trying to tell a person to not believe their own minds when we tell them that something that they don't consent to is something that they actually do consent to. Huemer just says this doesn't work. Third principle. Remember, actions imply consent only if it can be assumed that not taking the action would not generate an obligation. We sort of get the same objection here as the last one. Even if you didn't give any consent to the government, the state will still impose those same laws on you, the same taxes, regardless of how much objection you offer. So again, the problem of anarchists seems to be a genuine one for the social contract theorist. And he's going to say, even if you are the sort of individual who's participating in the political process, that doesn't show that you're agreeing to the social contract. Because you're not signing up for something that you're bound to be part of no matter what you do. And in this way, it's not implicit consent through participation. If you say, go out and vote for libertarian candidates. Here's the last point, that contractual obligation is mutual and conditional. That in a contract, what we are doing is having each individual guaranteeing something to the other party. So on this line of thought, we would assume that the states end of the contract, that is, their obligation, is to enforce and protect a citizen's rights, to say, protect you from crime and foreign invaders, to make peace, as Hobbes would put it. Maybe also to provide you with certain government benefits like education or healthcare. Uh, but we'll notice that a state will, on many occasions, fail to protect people's rights in serious ways, and these failures happen quite a lot, right? So there are situations where the state fails to protect us from foreign invaders. They fail to protect us from crime, and they might give us, say, subpar services, whether that be road repairs or whether that be education or healthcare. A really horrifying case that Huemer appeals to is a situation from 1975. There were 3 women living in a house in Washington, D.C., and an intruder broke into their house, and, well, 2 of the roommates managed to get upstairs and call the police, and these roommates then saw the police drive by the house, do a half-hearted check on the front door when the intruders actually broken through the back door. And at this point, the intruders kidnapped the women, physically and sexually assaulted them in horrible, awful, traumatic ways. This is a horrifying story, but Huemer says that it has a philosophical point. And the big point is this. These women eventually tried to sue the government for failing to protect them, right? That this was a failure on the police and government's part to do that work of protecting and serving, right? And the legal reasoning behind the case, and the courts said this and they said it again when there was an attempt at an appeal, the state does have a duty to protect this thing called the public at large, but it doesn't have the right to protect individual citizens. Now, part of their reasoning was that we could never have a government that sustained itself for any amount of time if any individual grievance against the government could be seen as incurring on the government's part a duty of recourse, right? But Huemer's basically saying, well, if that's how the government is reasoning, then there is not any mutuality and there is not conditionality, right? Because, for instance, if you failed to provide your taxes and said to the government, well, the contract between the state and the citizen is indirect. It's actually a contract between the state and the public at large, not me as an individual. Well, that means so long as the public at large is paying their taxes, well, then I, as an individual, don't have to. But that's not how it goes, right? If you, as an individual, don't pay your taxes, the government will come after you for tax evasion. But in this way, we're not seeing the kind of mutuality of the contract, and we'll see that even if the government fails you, you still have to follow the laws and pay your taxes. And here's Huemer's interpretation of the situation. He says that the government is basically having it both ways here. You cannot maintain that the individual owes duties to the state, but also claim that the state owes nothing to the individual. This is a violation of that 4th principle of contracts. So, as Huemer puts it, you are not bound to any contract in a situation where the other party repudiates that very contract. And so, as Huemer puts it, even if you are happy paying your taxes, even if you like the laws that you are subject to, he's going to say that your relationship with the government is non-voluntary, it's not up to you, it's not contractual because there's no mutuality or conditionality, and so it's not a social contract even if you like the government. So here's a final thing to consider. We might then see how we can fit Huemer's view together with others' views. How would Hobbes reply here? Now, one thing that we noticed in Hobbes is that the relationship between the sovereign and the subject, Hobbes is quite clear. It's not a mutual relationship and it's not reciprocal because the sovereign, according to Hobbes, is not bound by a covenant to you. You are in covenants with other citizens, and the sovereign is simply the enforcer above all of these different contracts that brings in disincentives when people disobey, right? So on that version of the view, Hobbes's version of the social contract theory is about what we owe to other citizens rather than what we owe to the state. But at that point, Huemer might then insist, well, then we still haven't given a theory of legitimate political authority. And it would bring out bigger disputes between Huemer and Hobbes. For instance, Hobbes tells us that there's no such thing as justice or injustice in the state of nature prior to there being any laws. But Huemer, it seems like, would insist that there are things that you have the right to, and there are things that are unjust, even in the state of nature. Right? So this is a bigger philosophical point about where right and wrong and just and unjust. So, as Huemer could put it, even though, according to Hobbes, the government hasn't laid down any rights, they can still wrong us. Right? So if there is a social contract, and a legitimate one, and one worth respecting, we would need more mutuality and reciprocality to it. Okay, so we'll wrap up there for today. As we've seen, traditional social contract theories fail, according to Huemer, because what we're looking for in a situation of consent, whether it be explicit or implicit, just doesn't seem to be the kind of thing going on in really any modern state, according to Huemer. And in that way, we haven't come up with a good answer to the question of what legitimates government. Now, Huemer has a whole book. We've just looked at one of his answers, although I encourage you to look closer, read more deeply if you want to go into, for instance, the question of whether democracy can provide the answer to the problem of political authority. Huemer will argue in the negative. He's, in the end, going to say that political authority is an illusion. But we're going to keep moving forward, getting more perspectives on the table. So next week, we're going to look at some questions about the relationship between the existence of government and freedom. And we're going to look at two surprising answers to the question of what that relationship is. And we're going to look first at a chapter from a book by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. Her book is called Private Government. We're going to look at Lecture 2. And we're also going to look at an essay by the philosopher Hannah Arendt. This essay is called What is Freedom? So that's where we're going to go. Thanks for listening in today. And if you have any thoughts or questions that you'd like me to hear, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right. Thanks very much. Take care.